There is a particular quality to late afternoon light in the hill country, when the sun begins its slow descent behind the rolling landscape, and everything seems to pause just for a moment between the busyness of day and the quiet promise of evening. It was in such a light that Sarah first saw the old honey house tucked into a gentle slope where wildflowers grew in careless abundance and ancient live oaks spread their branches like welcoming arms. She had been driving for hours, winding along country roads that seemed to exist outside of time, past fields where cattle grazed in contentment and farmhouses sat comfortably in their foundations, worn smooth by generations. The radio had long since faded to static, and she had driven the last hour in silence, with only the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional song of a bird to keep her company. The honey house had belonged to her great-aunt Margaret, a woman Sarah had met only a handful of times, but who had left an impression as lasting as the scent of honeysuckle on a summer breeze. Margaret had passed away quietly in her sleep 3 months ago, at the age of 92, and had left the property to Sarah with a simple note: "For when you need a place to rest." Sarah had needed that place more than she could have articulated. Her life in the city had become a blur of deadlines and obligations, of alarm clocks and traffic, and the constant buzz of her phone. She had been an editor at a publishing house, a job she had once loved. But somewhere along the way, the joy had leaked out of it, replaced by a weariness that settled into her bones and wouldn't leave. When the lawyer had called about the inheritance, something in Sarah had simply decided. She had given notice at her job, packed what she could fit in her car, and pointed herself toward this small town she had visited only as a child, toward this property she barely remembered. Now, as she turned down the long gravel drive, past a weathered wooden sign that read "Sweetwater Honey" in faded letters, she felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. The drive was lined with wildflowers, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susans and prairie verbena. Butterflies drifted between the blooms, and somewhere nearby she could hear the drowsy hum of bees going about their ancient work. The house itself was smaller than she remembered, but more charming. It was a simple structure, painted white many years ago, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. A tin roof, now weathered to a soft pewter, would sound like music when the rain came. Behind the house, she could see the honey house itself, a smaller building where Margaret had processed the honey, and beyond that, a meadow that stretched toward a line of trees. Sarah parked her car and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, taking it all in. The quiet here was different from the quiet of her apartment in the city. It wasn't an absence of sound, but rather a different quality of sound. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a dove, the ever-present hum of bees. It was a quiet that seemed to have depth and texture, layers she could sink into. She got out of the car slowly, her legs stiff from the drive, and stood in the golden light. The air smelled of grass and flowers and something sweet she couldn't quite name. Honey, perhaps, or simply the scent of a place where things grew slowly and well. The porch steps creaked under her feet, a friendly sound like the house was saying hello. The key the lawyer had sent her fit smoothly in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a front room filled with the soft light of late afternoon. Dust motes danced in the air, undisturbed for months, and yet the house didn't feel abandoned. It felt patient, as if it had been waiting. The furniture was simple and well-worn, a sofa with faded floral upholstery, a rocking chair by the window, a bookshelf lined with volumes whose spines were cracked from reading. In the kitchen, she found Margaret's teacups still hanging on their hooks, her apron still draped over a chair. It was as if the old woman had simply stepped out for a moment and might return at any time. Sarah found herself moving slowly through the rooms, trailing her fingers along surfaces, opening cabinets and drawers with the gentle curiosity of an archaeologist. In a bedroom at the back of the house, she found a quilt folded at the foot of the bed, its pattern of interlocking rings stitched in fabrics that must have been bright once, but had faded to soft, muted tones. The bed itself looked inviting, and Sarah realized suddenly how tired she was. But something drew her outside again, out the back door and down a worn path toward the honey house. The building was larger than the main house, with wide doors that stood slightly ajar. Sarah pushed one open and stepped inside. The space was filled with equipment she didn't recognize. Large metal containers, extractors, settling tanks. Everything was clean, but clearly hadn't been used in some time. The air here was thick with the scent of honey and beeswax, a smell so rich and sweet that Sarah felt she could almost taste it. Along one wall were shelves lined with jars, some empty, some still filled with honey that glowed like amber in the slanting light. She picked up one of the jars, surprised by its weight, and held it up to the light. The honey inside was a deep golden color, almost orange, and when she tilted the jar, it moved slowly, viscously, taking its time. The label, written in Margaret's careful hand, read, "Wildflower, Spring 2024. Sarah set the jar down carefully and continued to explore. There was a wooden desk in one corner, and on it she found a leather-bound journal. She opened it carefully, and Margaret's handwriting flowed across the page. "The bees know things we have forgotten. They know the value of patience, of steady work, of community. They know that sweetness comes from gathering the small treasures of each day." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, though she couldn't have said exactly why. She closed the journal gently and left it where she'd found it, making a mental note to come back and read more later. Outside, the sun was lower now, painting the sky in shades of peach and rose. Sarah walked through the meadow behind the honey house, and that's when she saw them, the hives. There were perhaps 24 of them, white boxes arranged in a loose semicircle at the far edge of the meadow. And around them, in the air and on the flowers, thousands of bees went about their work with a purpose and grace that made Sarah stop and simply watch. She knew nothing about beekeeping. She had no idea how to care for these hives, these creatures that Margaret had tended so carefully. But standing there in the fading light, watching the bees dance from flower to flower, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not quite peace, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of peace. A sense that she had found a place where time moved differently, where she might learn to rest. As the sky deepened to purple and the first stars began to appear, Sarah walked slowly back to the house. Tomorrow, she would begin to figure out what came next. But tonight, she would sleep in Margaret's bed under the handmade quilt, and she would let the gentle hum of the bees, still audible through the open window, carry her into dreams. Sarah woke to a light she had forgotten existed, the gentle, gradual light of dawn in the country, so different from the sudden glare of her bedroom. In the city, where the sun bounced off buildings and hit her windows all at once. Here, the light seemed to seep in slowly, politely, as if asking permission before filling the room. She lay still for a moment, listening. Birds were singing their morning conversations, a whole chorus of them. And beneath that, she could hear the bees, always the bees, their hum a constant backdrop, like the breathing of the land itself. In the kitchen, she found coffee in the freezer. Margaret had been prepared for guests, apparently, even long after she was gone. And she made a pot while standing at the window, watching the day brighten. The coffee was strong and good, and she took her cup out to the porch, wrapping herself in a blanket she'd found on the couch. The morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of dew-damp earth and flowers just beginning to open. Sarah sat in the rocking chair and let herself simply be, for what felt like the first time in years. No phone buzzing with notifications, no urgent emails to answer, no meetings to prepare for. Just this, coffee and morning light and birdsong. She was on her second cup when she saw him, an older man walking up the drive with a slow, steady gait. He wore overalls and a straw hat, and he carried what looked like a toolbox. As he got closer, Sarah could see that his face was deeply tanned and lined, but his eyes were bright and kind. She stood, suddenly aware that she was still in her pajamas, with a blanket around her shoulders. But the man just smiled and raised a hand in greeting. "You must be Sarah," he called out. "I'm Hank Crowley. I live just over that rise there. I've been helping keep an eye on Margaret's bees since she passed." Sarah came down the porch steps to meet him. "Thank you," she said. "I was actually wondering. I don't know anything about beekeeping. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Hank's smile widened. "Well, that's why I came by. Margaret and I were friends for near about 40 years. She called me a couple months before she died, made me promise I'd help you get started if you wanted to keep the bees." "I do," Sarah heard herself say, surprising herself. I think I do. I don't want to abandon what she built here." "Good," Hank said simply. "That's real good. How about I show you the basics today? We'll take it slow. The bees, they're patient teachers." And so Sarah's education began. She went inside and changed into jeans and a long sleeved shirt, and Hank provided her with a bee suit that had belonged to Margaret, white and worn soft from use. He showed her how to light the smoker, a device that puffed cool smoke to calm the bees. He taught her to move slowly and deliberately around the hives, to breathe calmly, to respect the creatures whose home she was entering. "Bees respond to fear," Hank explained as they approached the first hive. "Not because they can read your mind, but because when you're afraid, you move differently. You tense up. You make sudden movements. The bees, they just want to protect their home. You show them respect, move gentle, and most of the time, they'll let you do what you need to do." Sarah watched as Hank opened the first hive, removing the top cover to reveal the frames inside, each one covered with bees. They moved across the surface in patterns that seemed both random and purposeful, and their hum grew louder, more insistent. "This here's a healthy hive," Hank said, his voice calm and even. "See how many bees there are, how active they are. This colony is doing just fine." He pulled out one of the frames, and Sarah gasped. The frame was covered entirely in bees, so many that she couldn't see the wood or the comb beneath. But as she looked closer, she began to see order in what had seemed like chaos. Some bees were clearly working on the comb itself, building it out in perfect hexagons. Others were packing pollen into cells. Still others were capping honey, sealing it away for later. "It's like a city," she breathed. "Exactly like that," Hank agreed. "Every bee has a job, and they all work together. The queen, she's in here somewhere, laying eggs. The workers, they're doing everything else, nursing the young, building comb, gathering nectar, guarding the entrance. It's a whole world in here." He pointed out different things as he went. Capped brood, where the baby bees were developing, cells packed with bright orange pollen, cells glistening with honey. Sarah found herself leaning in, fascinated despite her initial nervousness. "Now you try," Hank said, sliding the frame back into place. "Open the next hive." Sarah's hands shook slightly as she took the hive tool, but she did as Hank had shown her, prying gently at the top cover until it came loose. Smoke puffed from the smoker as she opened the hive, and the bees' hum changed pitch slightly, but didn't become aggressive. "That's it," Hank encouraged. "Nice and easy. They can tell you're new at this, but they also know you're not here to hurt them." Sarah pulled out a frame, her movements slow and careful, and felt a rush of something like joy as she saw the bees covering it, going about their work unconcerned by her presence. A few crawled onto her gloved hands, exploring, and she forced herself to stay calm, to remember what Hank had said about fear. They spent the rest of the morning going through the hives, and Hank showed her how to assess the health of each colony, what to look for, what to worry about. By the time they were done, Sarah's arms were tired, and her mind was full of new information. But she felt something else, too, a sense of accomplishment, of having learned a language she hadn't known existed. Back at the house, Hank declined her offer of lunch, but accepted a glass of water. They sat on the porch in a comfortable silence, and Sarah realized that silence with another person was something she had forgotten could be comfortable. "Margaret loved those bees," Hank said eventually. "But more than that, she loved what they taught her. Patience, attention, the value of doing things in their own time." "That's what her journal said," Sarah told him. "I found it in the honey house." "She kept journals for 40 years, Hank said. "Every season, every observation. You'll learn a lot from reading those when you're ready." He stood to go, and Sarah walked him down to his truck. "I'll come by in a few days," he said. "Check on you and the bees. But you've got my number if you need anything before then. Don't be afraid to call." After he left, Sarah went back to the honey house and retrieved Margaret's journal. She spent the rest of the afternoon on the porch, reading her great-aunt's observations, her notes about weather and blooms, about the personality of different colonies, about the lessons she was learning. The handwriting itself was soothing, careful, and clear, and Sarah found herself relaxing into it, letting the words wash over her. As evening came on, she made herself a simple dinner from the groceries she'd bought on the drive-in, a sandwich and some fruit, and took it out to eat on the porch. The light was golden again, and the bees were returning to their hives, their day's work done. She watched them, these small creatures who had become her responsibility and her teachers, and felt grateful. That night, she fell asleep with the journal on her bedside table and the sound of the bees humming through the window screen. And she slept more deeply than she had in months. The days began to find a pattern, gentle and unhurried. Sarah would wake with the light and take her coffee to the porch, watching the world come alive. She learned to recognize the different birds by their songs, the cheerful call of the cardinal, the conversational chatter of the house finches, the liquid notes of the mockingbird who seemed to live in the oak tree nearest the house. After breakfast, she would walk out to check on the bees. This became her morning meditation, suiting up and moving slowly among the hives, watching the entrance of each one to see the bees coming and going. She learned to read their behavior, to see in the way they flew whether they were content or agitated, whether the hive was thriving or struggling. Hank came by twice a week, and under his patient guidance, Sarah learned more. She learned about the seasons of beekeeping, how the colonies built up in spring and summer, how they would slow down in fall and cluster together for warmth in winter. She learned about the different flowers that bloomed throughout the year and how they affected the flavor of the honey. Lighter in spring when the bees worked the fruit tree blossoms, darker in summer when they gathered from the wild flowers. Every batch of honey is different, Hank explained one day as they sat in the honey house, looking at the jars Margaret had left behind. It's like a record of that particular time and place. You can taste the season in it, the weather, what was blooming. People forget that when they buy honey at the grocery store. They think it's all the same, but it's not. It's as unique as wine from different vineyards. Sarah began to read voraciously, working her way through the books on Margaret's shelves. There were books about beekeeping, of course, but also books about wildflowers, about the ecology of prairies, about the history of the hill country. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch and read until the light faded, and then she would go inside and read by lamplight until her eyes grew heavy. The town itself was small, just a few blocks of Main Street, with a post office, a general store, a diner, and a handful of other businesses. Sarah ventured in once a week for supplies, and each time she found that a few more people knew her name, would stop to say hello, would ask how she was settling in. There was June, who ran the general store, a woman in her 60s with silver hair always pinned up in a bun and a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. There was Tom at the diner, who made the best pecan pie Sarah had ever tasted and who remembered that she liked her coffee black after just one visit. There was the mailman, whose name was Albert, who always had a kind word and who mentioned that he'd been good friends with Margaret. She was something special, Albert told Sarah one day as he handed her a small bundle of mail, mostly junk, but also a letter from her mother. Always had time for people, always interested in what you had to say. This town, it's a little dimmer without her light, you know? Sarah did know. She was beginning to understand through the people who had known Margaret, through her journals, through the care with which she had tended her bees and her land, what kind of woman her great-aunt had been. And she felt increasingly the weight and the gift of carrying on that legacy. One morning, About 3 weeks after her arrival, Sarah was checking the hives when she noticed something different about one of them. The bees at the entrance seemed agitated, and when she opened the hive, she found the reason. It was packed full of honey. Every frame was heavy with it, the cells capped and gleaming. She called Hank, excitement making her voice rise. "I think one of the hives is ready to harvest," she said. He arrived within the hour, and together they went through the hive, confirming what Sarah had seen. "You're right," he said, pride evident in his voice. "This is good timing, too. We want to harvest before the weather turns. How about tomorrow? I'll bring my equipment, and we'll do it right." That night, Sarah could barely sleep. She felt like a child before Christmas, anticipating something wonderful. When tomorrow came, she was up before dawn, too excited to stay in bed. Hank arrived mid-morning with his truck loaded with equipment, a honey extractor, settling tanks, filters, and jars. They set up in the honey house, and then they suited up and went to the hive. Harvesting honey was more work than Sarah had imagined. Each frame had to be carefully removed, brushed free of bees, and carried to the honey house. There, Hank showed her how to use a hot knife to slice off the wax cappings, revealing the honey beneath. The frames went into the extractor, which spun them around, using centrifugal force to fling the honey out against the walls, where it dripped down into a collection tank. The work was sticky and sweet, and by the end of the day, Sarah's arms ached and her hands were covered in honey despite the gloves she'd worn. But as they filtered the honey into the settling tank and she saw the golden liquid flowing, she felt a satisfaction unlike anything she'd known in her old life. "This," Hank said, gesturing at the tank of honey, "is what your bees made from all those flowers in the meadow. Every drop represents thousands of trips, thousands of blossoms. It's a miracle when you think about it. They left the honey to settle overnight. And the next day, Hank showed Sarah how to bottle it. They filled jar after jar, each one a small sun glowing with captured light. As they worked, Hank told her about the farmer's market that happened every Saturday in the town square. Margaret used to sell there, he said. People loved her honey. If you wanted to keep that going, I know they'd be happy to have you. The idea both excited and terrified Sarah. She had never been a salesperson. But the thought of sharing this honey, this miracle of flower and bee and summer sun with other people, that appealed to her. "I'll think about it," she said. That evening, she sat on the porch with a jar of the fresh honey and a spoon. She opened the jar slowly, the lid making a soft pop as the seal broke. The smell of the honey rose up, sweet and complex, and when she dipped the spoon in and brought it to her mouth, she understood what Hank had meant. It didn't taste like the honey from the store. It tasted like the wild flowers in the meadow, like sunshine and warm days, like the work of thousands of bees over countless hours. It tasted like this place, this particular spot on earth at this particular time. Sarah sat there as the light faded, savoring the honey, savoring the moment. And she felt something shift inside her. The weight she had been carrying, the exhaustion that had driven her here, began to lift. Not all at once. Healing was slower than that, she was learning, but enough that she could feel the difference, could sense the possibility of becoming whole again. Sarah spent the next week preparing. She cleaned and polished the jars until they gleamed. She designed labels, trying to capture the simple elegance of Margaret's handwriting. She settled on cream-colored paper with a border of hand-drawn wildflowers and the words, "Sweetwater Honey, Wildflower Harvest, 2024, in a font that felt both traditional and warm. June at the general store let her use the printer to make copies, and Sarah spent an evening carefully affixing labels to jars, making sure each one was straight. She arranged them in the wooden crates Margaret had used, cushioning them with clean cloth. On Friday evening, Hank stopped by to see her preparations. He nodded approvingly at the jars, at the labels, at the care she'd taken. Margaret would be proud, he said simply. Saturday morning arrived bright and clear. Sarah loaded the crates into her car with hands that trembled slightly with nervousness. She had dressed carefully, jeans and a simple white blouse, wanting to look approachable but professional. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore small silver earrings that had been her grandmother's. The town square was already bustling when she arrived at 7:30. Farmers and makers were setting up their booths, arranging produce and baked goods, crafts, and flowers. The air was filled with greetings and laughter, the sound of a community gathering. Sarah found the spot that Hank had reserved for her. Margaret's old spot, he'd told her. It was under a large pecan tree with a good view of the square. She set up her folding table and arranged the jars in rows, the morning sun making them glow like amber jewels. She had brought 24 jars, and now, looking at them, she worried it was too much. What if no one bought any? What if she spent the whole morning sitting here alone? But her fears proved unfounded. By 8 o'clock, when the market officially opened, she already had customers. Mrs. Henderson, who taught at the elementary school, bought 2 jars. "I remember Margaret's honey," she said, her eyes kind. "Best I ever tasted. I'm so glad you're continuing her work." More people came, drawn by the beautiful jars, by the story of Sarah carrying on her great-aunt's legacy, by simple curiosity. Sarah found herself relaxing into conversation, telling people about the bees, about the meadow, about learning from Hank. People shared their own memories of Margaret, painting a picture of a woman who had been deeply woven into the fabric of this community. By mid-morning, she had sold half her jars. Tom from the diner stopped by and bought 4. "I'll use this in my baking," he said, "and I'll tell people where it came from. Nothing like local honey." An older woman named Dorothy lingered at the table, picking up different jars, holding them to the light. "You can see the quality," she murmured, "the clarity. Margaret taught you well." "Actually, I've only been here a few weeks," Sarah admitted. "I'm still learning." Dorothy smiled. "Learning is the work of a lifetime, dear. The fact that you're doing it with such care, that's what matters." Around 11, there was a lull in customers, and Sarah took the opportunity to walk around the market herself. She bought fresh tomatoes and peaches from a farmer named Carlos, who grew them in organic fields outside of town. She got a loaf of sourdough bread from a woman named Hannah, who baked in a wood-fired oven. She stopped at the booth of a woman who made beautiful pottery and bought a honey pot, thinking of the empty one she'd seen in Margaret's kitchen. As she walked, people greeted her by name. They asked how she was settling in, how the bees were doing. She realized that she was becoming part of something, being woven into the same fabric that had held Margaret. By 1 o'clock, when the market officially ended, Sarah had sold all but 3 jars. She was tired, but it was a good tired, the kind that comes from meaningful work. As she packed up her table, Hank appeared to help. "How'd it go?" he asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. "Better than I hoped," Sarah admitted. "People were so kind. They all had stories about Margaret." "She touched a lot of lives," Hank said. "Now you're doing the same. Different lives, maybe, but the same kindness, the same care." They loaded the crates into Sarah's car, and Hank waved as he headed to his own truck. Sarah was about to get in her car when she heard her name. "Sarah? Sarah Mitchell?" She turned to see a woman about her own age, with dark, curly hair and warm brown eyes. She looked familiar, but Sarah couldn't quite place her. "I'm Emily," the woman said. "Emily Brennan? We used to play together when you'd visit Margaret. You probably don't remember. We were pretty young." But Sarah did remember, suddenly and vividly. A girl with pigtails and scraped knees, days spent catching fireflies and drinking lemonade on Margaret's porch. "Emily, of course I remember. How are you?" "I'm good. I heard you'd moved back and I've been meaning to stop by, but..." Emily shrugged. "Life, you know. But I saw you here today and I wanted to say hi. Maybe we could get coffee sometime. Catch up?" Sarah found herself smiling, genuinely pleased. "I'd like that." They exchanged phone numbers. And as Sarah drove home, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, the beginning of friendship, the promise of connection. In the city, she'd had colleagues and acquaintances, people she went to lunch with or saw at parties. But she'd been lonely there in a way she hadn't quite acknowledged. Here, with far fewer people around, she felt less alone. At home, she unpacked her remaining jars and the produce and bread she'd bought. She made herself a simple lunch, fresh tomatoes with salt, slices of the sourdough bread drizzled with honey, and took it out to the porch. The bees were busy in the meadow, and she could see Hank's truck in the distance, heading up the road toward his place. This, Sarah thought, taking a bite of tomato and tasting the summer in it. This was what she had been missing. Not just the quiet or the slower pace, but the connection to place, to people, to the source of things. She was beginning to understand why Margaret had stayed here all those years, why she had chosen this life of bees and honey and careful attention. That night, Sarah slept deeply once again, lulled by the familiar hum of the bees and the satisfaction of a day well spent. As August melted into September, Sarah noticed the changes beginning. The light shifted, still bright, but with a different quality, less harsh, more golden. The mornings were cooler, requiring a light jacket when she went out to check the bees. The wildflowers in the meadow began to fade, giving way to the late-season blooms, asters and goldenrod, their colors rich and deep. The bees' behavior changed too. They became more focused, more urgent in their work. Hank explained that they were preparing for winter, gathering the last of the nectar and pollen, building up their stores. "They know," he said one day, as they stood watching the entrance to one of the hives. "They can feel the season turning even before we can. They're getting ready." Sarah had been getting ready too, in her own way. She had settled into the house, making it gradually more her own, while still honoring Margaret's presence. She had rearranged some furniture, brought in some of her own books, hung a few pictures, but she had kept Margaret's teacups, her apron, the quilt on the bed. They felt like blessings, like the gentle touch of a guiding hand. She had coffee with Emily twice, and each time they talked longer than they'd planned, surprised by how easily the conversation flowed. Emily was a teacher at the local elementary school, 3rd grade, and she talked about her students with a warmth that reminded Sarah of Margaret's journals. The same careful attention, the same genuine interest in the small details that made each person unique. "You should come talk to my class," Emily suggested during their second coffee date, "about the bees. Kids love that stuff, and it would be educational." Sarah agreed, though the idea made her nervous. She had never been comfortable speaking in front of groups. But Emily's confidence in her was reassuring, and besides, talking about the bees was becoming easier. She was learning their language, understanding their ways. The talk was scheduled for the last week of September. Sarah prepared carefully, creating a simple presentation with photos of the hives, of the bees at work, of the honey being harvested. She brought samples of honey for the children to taste, and she brought her bee suit to show them. The children were wonderful, curious, and engaged, asking questions that ranged from the practical, "Do bees ever sting you?" to the philosophical, "Do bees know they're making honey for us?" Sarah found herself relaxing, enjoying their enthusiasm, their unfiltered wonder. After the presentation, several children came up to thank her, and one little girl with bright eyes and dark braids gave her a picture she'd drawn during class, a stick figure beekeeper surrounded by flowers and bees. "That's you," the girl, whose name was Lucia, said shyly, "with your bees." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you," she said, crouching down to be at Lucia's level. "This is beautiful. I'm going to put it on my refrigerator." And she did, as soon as she got home. She looked at it every morning after that, this gift from a child who had listened to her talk about bees and had seen something worth drawing. October arrived with crisp mornings and the smell of wood smoke from distant chimneys. The leaves on the trees began to turn, not the dramatic reds and oranges of the north, but softer colors, honey gold and burnt amber, russet and bronze. The light seemed to grow more precious as the days shortened. Each hour of sunshine something to be savored. Sarah harvested honey one more time, a smaller batch from the late season blooms. This honey was darker, with a richer, more complex flavor. Hank said it was some of the best he'd ever tasted. "The bees outdid themselves this year," he said. "Must be happy with their new keeper." At the farmer's market, Sarah had become a regular fixture. People would seek her out, not just to buy honey, but to chat, to share news, to ask her advice about their own gardens. She was no longer Margaret's niece, but Sarah, the beekeeper, part of the community in her own right. One Saturday, a young man named Daniel approached her table. He was probably in his late 20s, with an earnest face and hands that looked like they knew hard work. "I've been thinking about keeping bees," he said. "On my family's farm. We grow vegetables mostly, and I keep reading about how much bees help with pollination. Would you be willing to talk to me about it? Maybe show me your setup sometime?" Sarah found herself saying yes, offering to have him come by the following week. And when he did, she realized she was teaching now, passing on what Hank had taught her, what Margaret's journals had taught her, what the bees themselves had taught her. They spent an afternoon going through the hives, and Sarah showed Daniel everything she had learned. He listened with the same intensity she had brought to her own learning, asking good questions, taking notes. As they worked, she felt a continuation, a thread extending forward from Margaret to her, from her to Daniel, from him to whomever he might teach someday. The season continued its turn. November brought the first real cold, and Sarah followed Hank's instructions, preparing the hives for winter. They checked the honey stores, making sure each colony had enough to sustain them through the cold months. They reduced the entrances to help the bees keep the hive warm. They wrapped the hives in insulating material. "Now it's up to them," Hank said. "They'll cluster together, keeping the queen warm in the center. They'll rotate positions, making sure no bee stays on the cold outside too long. It's remarkable, really, how they take care of each other." Sarah thought about that as she worked, the way the bees cared for each other, the way they worked together, each one doing their part. It was a lesson she was still learning, this business of being part of a community, of both contributing and accepting help. Thanksgiving came, and Emily invited Sarah to join her family for dinner. Sarah almost declined, feeling like an intruder on what should be a family gathering. But Emily insisted, and so Sarah found herself around a table with Emily's parents, her brother and his wife, their 2 children, everyone talking and laughing and passing dishes back and forth. During grace, Emily's father mentioned Sarah by name, thanking God for bringing her to their community, for her continuing Margaret's work. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion, grateful in a way she couldn't quite articulate. After dinner, when she was helping Emily's mother with the dishes, the older woman touched her arm gently. "I was friends with Margaret," she said. "We were in the same quilting circle. She talked about you, you know. She always hoped you'd find your way here." "She did?" Sarah asked, surprised. "Oh, yes. She said you had a restless spirit like she'd had when she was young. She said this place saved her, helped her find peace. She wanted that for you, too." That night, driving home under a sky full of stars, Sarah thought about restless spirits and finding peace. She thought about Margaret, about the life she had built here, about the legacy she had left. And she thought about herself, about how much she had changed in just a few months. She was learning to move slowly, to pay attention, to be present. She was learning the rhythms of the seasons, the language of the bees. She was learning that sweetness came from gathering the small treasures of each day, from doing work that mattered, from being part of something larger than herself. As she pulled up to the house, she could see the hives in the moonlight, silent now in the cold. The bees were inside, clustered together, waiting for spring, and Sarah, climbing the porch steps and unlocking the door to the house that was becoming home, felt herself waiting too, not with anxiety, but with patience, with trust that spring would come, that the cycle would continue, that there would be more to learn, more to give, more to receive. She made herself a cup of tea with honey and took it to bed with her, along with Margaret's journal. She was reading through the 2nd year now, and Margaret's voice had become as familiar to her as her own. Tonight's entry was from a December evening many years ago. "The bees are quiet now, resting through the winter. Sometimes I go out just to stand near the hives, to remind myself that life continues even when I can't see it, when everything seems still. That's faith, I suppose, trusting in the unseen, believing in the return of warmth and bloom and busyness. The bees teach me this every year, this lesson I keep needing to learn. Rest is not an ending, but a preparation. Spring will come. Sarah closed the journal and set it on the bedside table. Through the window, she could see stars brilliant in the clear, cold sky. Somewhere out there, the bees were huddled together, keeping each other warm, waiting. And Sarah, pulling the quilt up around her shoulders, felt herself held by that same patience, that same trust. Sleep came easily these days, deep and dreamless and restorative. And if sometimes in her dreams she heard the hum of bees in summer meadows, saw golden light on honey-filled frames, felt the warmth of sun on her face as she worked among the flowers, well, those were the dreams of someone who had found their place, their purpose, their peace. December arrived with a cold snap that had Hank shaking his head and muttering about the changing climate. Sarah bundled up in layers, thermal underwear, flannel shirts, Margaret's old wool coat that she'd found in the closet and that still smelled faintly of honey and lavender. The meadow that had been so full of life and color was now brown and dormant. The wild flowers reduced to dry stalks that rattled in the wind. But there was beauty in this too, Sarah was learning. The stark lines of the trees against the winter sky, the way frost silvered everything in the morning, the quality of light, thin and clear and somehow more honest than the abundant light of summer. She checked the hives less frequently now, not wanting to disturb the bees during their winter rest. But she would walk out to them anyway, standing in the cold, listening to the silence that wasn't quite silence. If she stood very still, very close, she could hear a faint hum from inside the hives, the sound of the bees keeping each other warm, of life persisting through the lean season. With less work to do outside, Sarah turned her attention to the honey house. She spent days cleaning and organizing, going through Margaret's things with care and respect. She found more journals, a whole shelf of them dating back to when Margaret had first started keeping bees. She found recipes for things to make with honey and beeswax. She found photographs, Margaret as a young woman standing proud beside her first hive. Margaret in middle age, her hair going gray, holding up a frame dripping with honey. Margaret in her later years, sitting on the porch with Hank, both of them smiling at the camera. Sarah had the best of these photos framed and hung them in the honey house, creating a gallery of sorts, a history of this place, and the woman who had built it. She added one photo of her own, one that Emily had taken at the farmer's market, showing Sarah behind her table of honey jars, laughing at something someone had said. Looking at it, Sarah almost didn't recognize herself. The tension that had marked her face in the city was gone. She looked relaxed, happy, present. In the evenings, she worked on a project that had been growing in her mind. She had been thinking about Margaret's journals, about all the wisdom they contained, not just about beekeeping, but about life, about patience, about paying attention. She began transcribing some of the entries, organizing them by theme rather than chronology. She wasn't sure yet what she'd do with them, but the work itself was satisfying. a way of spending time with Margaret, of learning from her even now. Christmas approached, and Sarah found herself both looking forward to it and dreading it. This was her first holiday season away from her family, and while her relationships with her parents and siblings had never been difficult, they'd never been particularly close either. She had called her mother a few times since moving, brief conversations where she tried to explain what she was doing, why she was here, but she wasn't sure her mother understood. "You gave up your career for bees?" her mother had said during their last call, her voice carrying a mixture of confusion and concern. "Sarah, I just don't understand what you're doing." "I'm living, Mom," Sarah had replied, surprising herself with a certainty in her voice. Maybe for the first time in a long time. Now, as Christmas drew closer, Sarah decided to host something small. She invited Hank and Emily, Tom from the diner, June from the general store, a few others who had become friends. She spent a day baking, cookies made with honey, bread, a cake. The house filled with good smells, and Sarah found herself humming as she worked, feeling something she hadn't felt during the holidays in years. Genuine joy. On Christmas Eve, her guests arrived bearing dishes and gifts, and the small house filled with warmth and laughter. They ate too much and told stories, and Hank brought out his guitar and played carols, his voice surprisingly strong and sweet. Sarah looked around at these people who had welcomed her, who had become her community, and felt a gratitude so intense it was almost painful. Later, after everyone had gone home and she was cleaning up the last of the dishes, she found an envelope on the table. Her name was written on it in handwriting she recognized from countless hours of reading journals. Margaret's handwriting. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the envelope. Inside was a letter dated just a few weeks before Margaret's death. "Dear Sarah," it read, "if you're reading this, it means you came. I wasn't sure you would. You always seemed so caught up in the busyness of your life, so convinced that meaning was something you had to chase rather than something you had to receive. But I hoped you'd remember this place, these bees, the particular peace that can be found in paying attention to small, important things. I'm leaving you this place not because I think you need property or financial security, but because I think you need what this place has to teach. The bees, they don't rush. They don't worry about productivity in the way we humans do. They simply do their work day after day, each small act building towards something beautiful and sustaining. You're probably tired, Sarah. I remember being tired in that way. Tired of trying to prove yourself, tired of feeling like you're never doing enough. This place, these bees, they don't need you to prove anything. They just need you to show up, to pay attention, to do the next right thing. I won't be there to teach you directly, but I've left my journals. Read them, not as instruction manuals, but as conversations. I wrote them for you, in a way, even before I knew you'd be the one to read them. Be patient with yourself, learning to rest, learning to simply be. It's harder than it sounds, but the bees will teach you if you let them. And the community here, they'll hold you while you learn. They held me. Welcome home, dear girl. This place has been waiting for you. With love, Margaret. Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, the letter in her hands, and wept. She wept for the years she'd spent rushing, striving, never feeling quite enough. She wept for Margaret, for the gift she'd given, for the wisdom she'd shared. She wept for the ways she was changing, the person she was becoming. And she wept with gratitude, pure and simple, for this unexpected grace, this second chance at living. Outside, snow began to fall, rare in this part of Texas, a gift of its own. Sarah watched it through the window, large flakes drifting down to settle on the dormant meadow, on the patient hives, on the porch where she had spent so many mornings. The world was being made new, white and clean, and full of possibility. She thought about the bees inside their hives, clustered together, keeping their queen warm, keeping each other safe. They were resting now, but they were also preparing. Inside those hives, the queen would start laying eggs soon, anticipating spring long before it arrived. The workers would begin their transformation from winter bees to summer bees. Life was continuing, even in this seeming stillness. Sarah folded Margaret's letter carefully and put it in the journal she'd been keeping. Her own record of observations, lessons, gratitudes. She made herself a cup of tea with honey and took it to the window, watching the snow fall, thinking about rest and preparation, about the cycles of work and dormancy, about the deep knowing that winter always gives way to spring. The first sign of spring came not as a date on the calendar, but as a subtle shift in the air, a gentling of the cold, a change in the light. Sarah noticed it one morning in late February, standing on the porch with her coffee, watching the sun rise. The sky had a different quality to it, a softness that spoke of warming days ahead. She had made it through her first winter at the honey house, and she felt different, settled in a way she hadn't been in years, maybe ever. The restlessness that had driven her in the city had been replaced by something else. Not complacency exactly, but a kind of calm purpose, a sense that she was where she needed to be, doing what she needed to do. The bees knew spring was coming before Sarah did. On the first warm day in early March, when the temperature climbed into the 60s, she heard the change in their hum, louder, more energetic. She suited up and opened one of the hives, and her heart lifted at what she saw. The cluster of bees had expanded, and on the frames she could see fresh young bees, fuzzy and pale, recently emerged from their cells. The queen had started laying again, and the colony was growing. "They made it," she told Hank when he came by to check on her preparations for the new season. "They made it through the winter." "They always do," Hank said with a smile. "Long as we give them what they need. Now, the real work begins again." He was right. As the days lengthened and warmed, the bees' activity increased exponentially. They needed more space, more frames, constant monitoring to make sure they didn't become overcrowded and swarm. Sarah found herself busy again, but it was a different kind of busy than she'd known in the city. This busy had a rhythm to it, a reason. She could see the results of her work immediately. Healthy colonies, frames filling with honey, bees dancing in the sunshine. The meadow came alive again, too. First came the early wildflowers, bluebonnets painting the landscape in swathes of blue, Indian paintbrush adding splashes of red. Then came the others, purple wine cups and yellow bitterweed, white prickly poppies and pink evening primrose. The bees worked them all, their leg sacks heavy with pollen as they returned to their hives. Sarah spent hours watching them, never tiring of the sight, Each bee was so small, so seemingly insignificant on its own, but together they accomplished such remarkable things. It was a lesson she kept learning, kept needing to learn, the power of small, consistent acts, the way individual effort combined into something much larger than the sum of its parts. In April, Emily convinced Sarah to speak to the garden club about keeping bees in suburban settings. Sarah was nervous. These were experienced gardeners, people who might know more than she did. But she prepared carefully and told herself that she had something to offer. Her experience, her enthusiasm, Margaret's wisdom. The talk went well. The garden club members asked thoughtful questions and shared their own observations about bees in their gardens. Several said they were considering keeping hives themselves, and Sarah offered to help them get started. Driving home that evening, she realized that she had found not just a home, but a calling. This work of teaching, sharing, continuing Margaret's legacy, it fed something in her that had been hungry for a long time. May brought the first major honey harvest of the season. Sarah had learned from the previous year, and the process went more smoothly. She had help too. Daniel, the young farmer she'd mentored, came to assist, along with Emily and Tom. They made a party of it, working together in the honey house, laughing and talking as they uncapped frames and ran the extractor. The honey this year was beautiful, a light, delicate golden color with a flavor that captured all the spring blooms. Sarah bottled it with labels she'd designed over the winter, simple and elegant, with a watercolor painting of bluebonnets that Emily had created. At the farmer's market, her honey sold out within the first hour. People had been waiting for it, and the demand was higher than she'd anticipated. She went home and bottled more, and the next week the same thing happened. By the third week of May, she realized she needed to think bigger, to plan for increased production. The thought both excited and scared her. She was happy with her small operation, with the manageable scale of things. But there was also a part of her that wanted to grow, to share this honey with more people, to expand Margaret's legacy. She talked it through with Hank one evening, sitting on his porch and watching the sunset. Margaret kept it small on purpose, Hank said. She could have expanded, could have made more money, but she wanted to keep it at a scale where she could give each hive individual attention, where she knew every colony personally. She said that was part of what made the honey special, the care. I understand that, Sarah said, but I also think she'd want the honey to reach people who need it, not for the money, but for the sharing. Hank nodded slowly. You're probably right. So the question is, how do you grow while keeping that care, that attention? How do you scale up without losing what makes it special? It was a question Sarah sat with for weeks, observing her bees, reading Margaret's journals, talking with other beekeepers at workshops and conferences. Gradually, an answer emerged. She wouldn't try to manage more hives herself. Instead, she would mentor others to keep bees, helping them establish their own operations. They could process their honey at her facility. She'd expand the honey house to accommodate this. And they could sell under a cooperative label with quality standards everyone agreed to maintain. It would be a way to strengthen the local ecosystem. More bees meant better pollination for everyone. It would be a way to build community, beekeepers helping each other, learning from each other. And it would be a way to honor Margaret's legacy while also making it her own. Sarah presented the idea to Daniel first, since he was already planning to start his own hives. He loved it. Then she mentioned it to a few others who had expressed interest in beekeeping. By the end of June, she had 5 people committed to the cooperative, eager to begin. The summer passed in a blur of activity. Sarah taught classes, helped new beekeepers set up their hives, expanded the honey house with the help of local contractors. There were challenges, a swarm that took hours to capture, a colony that succumbed to disease despite her best efforts, a week of rain that made it impossible to get into the hives. But there were triumphs too. The first harvest from Daniel's hives, beautiful honey from colonies he'd tended himself. A child at the farmer's market telling Sarah that her presentation had inspired her to study entomology. The way the cooperative members supported each other, showing up to help when someone needed extra hands. In August, Sarah got an unexpected call. It was from a magazine editor in Austin, asking if she'd be interested in writing an article about the cooperative, about sustainable beekeeping, about building community through agriculture. Sarah said yes before she could overthink it. The article took her a month to write, working on it in the evenings after the day's work was done. She wrote about Margaret and her legacy, about learning the language of bees, about what it meant to pay attention, to move at nature's pace, to build something that would last. She wrote about the cooperative and the vision behind it, not just producing honey, but creating connection, strengthening community, caring for the land. The article was published in October with photographs of the honey house, the hives, the cooperative members working together. Sarah's inbox filled with messages from people across the state, across the country, wanting to know more, wanting to start their own cooperatives, wanting to learn. It was overwhelming at first, all that attention. But Sarah thought about what Margaret had written in her journal, about how sweetness came from gathering small treasures each day. She couldn't respond to everyone at once, couldn't help every person who reached out. But she could do the next right thing, answer one email, make one connection, share one piece of knowledge. A year later, Sarah stood in the meadow on a warm spring morning, watching the bees work the bluebonnets. The meadow was larger now. She'd added 5 acres, seeded it with native wildflowers, created a haven not just for her bees, but for all pollinators. Butterflies drifted past, and she could hear the call of meadowlarks in the distance. Behind her, the honey house hummed with activity. The cooperative had grown to 12 members, and on processing days, the building was full of people and laughter and the sweet smell of honey. They had won an award from the State Agriculture Department for sustainable practices. They had been featured in 2 more magazines and had received a grant to teach beekeeping in underserved communities. But more than any of that, Sarah felt at peace. She had learned what Margaret had wanted to teach her. That meaning wasn't something you had to chase, but something you received by paying attention, by showing up, by doing the work that was in front of you with care and intention. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Emily approaching, carrying 2 cups of coffee. They sat together in the grass, sipping and watching the bees, comfortable in the easy silence of deep friendship. "I'm glad you came back," Emily said eventually. "So am I," Sarah replied. And she meant it with her whole heart. The bees continued their work, ancient and purposeful, gathering the small treasures of each day and transforming them into something sweet. And Sarah, sitting in the meadow with the morning sun warm on her face, felt herself part of that work, part of that transformation. She had found her place, her people, her purpose. She had learned to rest, to listen, to be still. She had learned that home wasn't just a place but a practice, the practice of presence, of attention, of care. The hum of the bees rose and fell like breathing, like waves, like the rhythm of days and seasons and years. Sarah closed her eyes and let it wash over her, this sound that had become the soundtrack of her life, this gentle reminder that all was well, that spring always followed winter, that sweetness came to those who were patient, who paid attention, who did their work with love. And as the morning brightened and the world woke fully to another day, Sarah Mitchell, beekeeper, teacher, student, friend, smiled and gave thanks for the unexpected grace of second chances, for the wisdom of bees, for the legacy of a woman who had known that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is a place to rest, to heal, to become whole. The bees hummed their approval, and the day unfolded, one precious moment at a time.